Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Generally speaking, when we think of Byzantine emperors who stand out from the rest in our imaginations, we tend to think of guys who either achieved great military glory, engaged in a hell of a lot of intrigue, took part in a lot of coups, engaged in all kinds of harebrained assassination attempts, or were at the center of various religious controversies. In the case of Leo V, he checks all of those boxes with the exception of winning any sort of great military glory. So I wonder, why is he not a more well-known Byzantine emperor? I don't know exactly why, but if I had to guess, I would say that it has something to do with his slavish imitation of Leo III and the fact that he fell a little short of Leo III. So today let's look at the life and times of Leo V and explore why, even if he's not among the great emperors of Byzantium, he is among the most interesting. Leo the Armenian actually had a very interesting life before becoming emperor. His father was the Armenian patrician Bardas, and he also had some Syrian heritage. This means that from an ethnic perspective, he was a little bit of an outsider in Constantinople, but because of his patrician rank, you can't really call him an outsider, and he would have had access to political power and inner circles in Constantinople for his entire life. He was born around the year 775 CE, which makes him about 5 or so years younger than his predecessor, Michael I. He first enters the historical record in 803, when he served under the rebel Bardanes Turkos. And as the likely outcome of Bardanes' usurpation became clear, Leo read the tea leaves and defected to Nicephorus I. He seems to have been rewarded for his conduct for defecting. Later on, he somehow managed to lose Nicephorus' favor, and he was stripped of the thematic command that he had been awarded. The sources are a bit divided on this. It looks like either he was punished for marrying Arsaber's daughter, and Arsaber was another guy who tried to challenge Nicephorus for the throne, or else he suffered a defeat at the hands of the Arabs, and he was punished accordingly. It's really hard to say. And because Leo had such a penchant for engaging in intrigue later, I think most people favor the idea that he was trying to marry Arsaber's daughter and stir up trouble, and that's why Nicephorus put a stop to it. Of course, Nicephorus died famously at Pliska in 811, and his successor, Michael I Rangabi, was on the throne for 2 years, and he was politically inept and in search of allies, and he found one in Leo the Armenian, because Leo was someone who was currently without a job, and he thought that he could win Leo's loyalty by making him a governor again. So he appointed Leo to the Anatolic theme, and in that office Leo managed to win a victory over the Arabs in Cilicia in 812. So after that, of course, Michael decided that Leo could be a go-to general, and he tried to bring him into Europe to help him fight the Bulgars, which ended up being the most fatal decision of Michael's career. By the summer of 813, Leo and his Anatolian troops had arrived in Europe, and they were to serve as a backbone for Michael's army. Michael had a lot of new recruits in his army after the disaster at Pliska a couple years before, and a lot of these men were not up to snuff yet. So the idea was that these troops from Asia would really provide a backbone and get the army in Europe back on its feet, and in the meantime help deal with the Bulgar crisis. And of course, Leo was going to be the commander of that wing of the army. Now, earlier, before the Battle of Versinicia, there was about a month or so where Michael was just dithering around in Thrace and not really campaigning in earnest, and that really helped alienate the Anatolian troops and also didn't impress anyone in particular. So, it's probable that if these troops were grumbling and unhappy, that Leo either fed into that in some way, or else he realized what the public mood was and tapped into it in some way. During the actual battle at Versinicia on June 22nd of 813, approximately 2 years after the disaster at Pliska, the Byzantines were actually winning the battle at first, and the Bulgars were on the verge of being routed. But then, Leo and his men departed from the field. They just withdrew. and that allowed Krum to rally his Bulgars, counterattack, and win another significant victory. One interesting question that is raised by the odd sequence of events at Versinicia is whether or not Leo's betrayal of Michael was done in collusion with Khan Krum. Now, it's almost certain that Leo had a plan before he betrayed Michael, given his well-known proclivity for using deception and ruses to get his way. We'll see over the course of his career that he uses ruse after ruse after ruse to get what he wants. The question is, was Leo actually working with Khan Krum, or was the Bulgar victory at Versinicia an unfortunate side effect of his betrayal? I tend to fall on the side of Versinicia being an accidental disaster, that Leo wanted Krum to win, but not by a lot, just enough to fully finish discrediting Michael and allow him to seize power. But the fact that Khan Krum was able to turn that into a full-blown victory was not something that Leo was counting on. And I also don't necessarily think that Leo and Khan Krum were actually in direct communication, but they may well have been. Ultimately, there is insufficient information to make a determination, but it is interesting to think about. The combination of betrayal and yet another massive battlefield defeat completely broke what remained of Michael Rangabi's spirit, and he was ready and willing to abdicate. So he named Leo as his co-emperor, and then he stepped down from power, and that avoided any need for a civil war. Leo V took the precaution of having Michael's sons castrated, but he did allow the Rangabi men to live out their lives as monks, and you can learn a little bit more about that by watching my video on Michael I. In order to secure Patriarch Nicephorus' blessing, Leo V swore that his views were orthodox, and he even showed respect to the prominent icon over the Chalky Gate as proof of his orthodoxy. The reason why Nicephorus would probably suspect that Leo's views were a bit off is because Leo had so much Eastern heritage, and because people from the eastern parts of the empire tended to be iconoclast. And it would turn out that if Nicephorus harbored those suspicions, that he was right. Upon seizing control, Leo V inherited the Bulgar problem that was created by the disaster at Pliska, and then further exacerbated by his own actions. Krum was greatly emboldened by his latest success at Versinicia, which was, I believe, the first time that he had taken his army out and engaged the Byzantines in a head-on conflict, and actually managed to achieve victory. Normally, the Bulgars avoided such things because the Byzantine army was much better suited for straight-out, set-piece battles. But at any rate, Krum was now camped beneath the walls of Constantinople, and there he was engaging in pagan ceremonies and also making displays of strength. And both of those things would have been offensive to the people of Constantinople because they undermined the Christian and imperial pretensions of the Byzantine people. Krum demanded that he be allowed to fix his lance on the Golden Gate in order to symbolize his achievements over the last several years and his dominance over Byzantium. Leo predictably refused this offer, and Krum, in retaliation, and in order to convince Leo to accept his symbolic victory, spent several days laying waste to the area outside of the city. Krum then proposed new peace talks, with his price being a large quantity of gold in order to depart, and also a bevy of local beautiful women to take back to Bulgaria with him. When Leo heard the news that Krum wanted to talk, he agreed to meet, and the two of them agreed to meet at the point of the Golden Horn without arms and with minimal attendance. Krum, by all indications, seems to have been acting in good faith, and he was serious about wanting to get his gold and his women and leave. However, Leo decided that this would be a great opportunity to snuff him out. So Leo agreed to meet, and he did so in bad faith, and he placed some assassins nearby and had them in wait. Now, as soon as they met, they were exchanging pleasantries, and Krum noticed that one of Leo's officials made an artificial gesture by rubbing his face, something like that, something that didn't really seem natural or appropriate, and he correctly interpreted that as a gesture to go ahead with a plan. So Krum immediately sprang onto his horse and rode away, barely escaping. Now, one can't help but wonder, what if Leo had actually employed a competent assassin like a Desmond Miles or a Corvo Attano? How different would history have gone? Well, we'll never know, because he apparently just hired the guys who gave us the Bay of Pigs. At any rate, though, the assassination attempt backfired in the worst way possible, because the Khan was only slightly wounded, but extremely pissed by the way that events had unfolded, and this will up the intensity of the war between Byzantium and the Bulgars to a new level of brutality that it had not yet achieved. After the assassination attempt, Krum seems to have been fully convinced that there was no point in negotiating with an enemy that you couldn't trust to keep their word, and he decided to up the ante of his brutality in order to bring Byzantium to heel. So Krum devastated the suburbs near the Golden Horn, and during that campaign he managed to carry off some marble columns, which he sent to his capital at Pliska. During the course of his campaign, he destroyed the city of Mesembria and nearly also captured the city of Heraclea, which barely held out. A lot of Byzantine citizens were spooked by the coming of Krum's army, and many people attempted to flee as refugees, but Krum dedicated resources to hunting them down in the hills and killing them. Krum then joined his brother's forces, which had been besieging Adrianople this whole time, and he helped to bring that siege to an end. He captured 10,000 or so locals, including the archbishop, and had them all killed. So as you can imagine, now Leo is feeling pressure to retaliate in kind, and that's exactly what he does. Due to Leo's failed assassination attempt, Krum's anger and brutality rose to a new level, and Leo was placed in a somewhat awkward situation where he didn't really have an adequate way to respond. On the one hand, it's pretty clear that Krum's army at this point was stronger and that Leo could not fight him in a head-on conflict, which meant that he was more or less powerless to prevent his subjects from getting massacred by Krum's main army. On the other hand, he did have enough of a military that he had to take some actions, and he would have to hit the Bulgars where they were weakest. So this was completely inadequate, but it was better than doing nothing, and it would hopefully help legitimate him in the eyes of his subjects. So some action was necessary. So Leo took his army and launched a surprise attack on a Bulgar army camped near Mesembria, a city which had fallen under Michael I, and he took this army by surprise and supposedly killed them while they slept. So that was a minor but meaningful victory, and it also showed a change in direction, since Michael had allowed the city to fall and now Leo had retaken it. Leo, rather than confronting the main Bulgar army, decided instead to enter Bulgar territory and attack civilians the way that Krum had been attacking his civilians. And he came up with a weird way of going about that. He spared the adults, but smashed their children's heads against rocks. And as you can imagine, these actions further enraged Krum, who now was resolved to capture Constantinople. Maybe he had thought that renewing hostilities and really upping the ante would bring Leo to the table, and in earnest, but that's not what happened. So now Krum believes that the only way to deal with the Byzantine threat once and for all is to destroy them and kick them out of Europe altogether. During the spring of 814, both Leo V and Krum were in the midst of furious preparations for the coming siege of Constantinople. Leo V went as far as to send envoys to Louis the Pious of the Franks, who had just succeeded his father Charlemagne, and he was asking for help in the form of a Frankish attack on the western frontiers of the Bulgars. However, Louis was preoccupied with other issues, and he said that he was not going to be able to help, which meant that Leo was on his own. And at this point, Leo and the Byzantines were pretty worried because they were in serious danger. They had lost quite a number of men, and they didn't know for sure if they were going to be able to hold off the Bulgars without suffering the loss of all of the gains that Nicephorus had made in the Balkans. However, fortune was on the side of the would-be assassins, because on April 13, 814, Krum ended up dropping dead of probably natural causes, and then peace broke out in earnest. Krum's son and successor Omertag had some internal problems. He was a young ruler, and he was apparently challenged by some of his aristocrats, so he had more things to worry about, and at this time it looks like Louis might have changed his mind about intervening on the western frontier, since Omertag was more worried about the Franks for most of his reign than about the Byzantines. Leo V, after this, at some unknown point, began a new policy that his successors would then intensify. And this new policy is to send out missionaries to convert the Bulgars to Christianity. Now, this ended up failing, but it did set a precedent that Byzantium would follow to great effect later, and that would be in the same 9th century, and the two guys on your screen are Cyril and Methodius, the brothers who helped to convert the Slavs to Christianity. Ironically, given the way that Leo V rose to power and then twice intensified the danger which his empire faced, his reign was actually mostly peaceful. He was the primary beneficiary of what is known as the Pax Nicephori. So, let's look at the empire's strategic situation now that Krum is dead. Krum's death means that Leo V was able to arrange peace in the Balkans with Krum's young son Omertag, who would be kept busy doing other things. That meant that now he could help consolidate the gains that Nicephorus had made, and that his subjects in the Balkans would now be able to get on with their lives and increase the prosperity and imperial control there. Out east, the new Abbasid Caliph Mamun was distracted by internal issues that were similar to the ones facing Omertag, and it would be a while before the Abbasids would be able to mount another major challenge to the Byzantines. In the west, the peace with Charlemagne and the Franks held as well, and that is technically what the Pax Nicephori is. The Frankish realm at this time was still united under Louis the Pious, so it was still a major potential rival to Byzantium if they were unfriendly, but they would remain friendly, and then ultimately after Louis the Pious it would divide among his sons. But that is still a ways off, and Leo V will not live to see that happen. So the effect of all this, of having peace with all of their major potential enemies, is that now Leo will have time to pursue his domestic agenda, and you probably already know this, but it will involve icons. If you'll recall, Leo III the Isaurian had come to power during a time of chaos. He had been a strong strategos in the east, and then he had overthrown a weak, unpopular emperor, Theodosius III. Leo V had been a strategos of a theme in the east, and then he had overthrown a weak and unpopular emperor, Michael I Rangabi. So up to this point, their careers are pretty similar. And it appears that these parallels were very obvious to Leo V, and he tried to deepen that connection and really reinforce it. So to make sure that everyone else saw the connection as well, Leo actually renamed his son and heir Constantine, because Leo III's son was the famous Constantine V, who had been the most successful emperor in recent memory, and was still somewhat of the pattern for what a successful emperor during this period looked like. Now, formerly, young Constantine's name had been Sembadias, but of course he would never be called that again. Leo also made the connection stronger by establishing political connections and friendship with the various descendants of Constantine V. And there's another connection that he was making, and that was with the still alive and well Iconoclast faction within the empire. Now, during the last few reigns from Irene on, we haven't really talked about the Iconoclast faction, but they're still there, and they still have some juice, and Leo V is tapping into that. As a good and dutiful student and imitator of Leo III, Leo V understood that the empire had done well during the period of Iconoclasm from 730 to 787, and then had struggled after 787 when Irene had restored the icons. And using this rather simplistic reading of history, Leo V was determined to forge ahead and ban the icons again. He seems to have genuinely believed that iconoclasm was the preference of God and that icons were offensive to God, and that that was the root of Byzantium's problems. That was the genuine belief of all of the iconoclasts, so far as I can tell. Now, John Julius Norwick is of the opinion that Leo V's iconoclasm was a purely pragmatic means of trying to appease discharged landless vets that Irene had recruited from the east, and who were still in a position to stir up trouble in Constantinople now that they were discharged and jobless. That may be a very minor factor, but I really don't think that was the primary motivation. I think that Leo V was dedicated to imitating Leo III, and that he was very sincere in his belief about icon policy. So at first, Leo V tried to work with Patriarch Nicephorus on this project, but the Patriarch balked since he was Orthodox and in favor of icons, and so Leo had to make some false assurances and then start to work on some underhanded means of getting to his objectives. As part of his plan to institute iconoclasm, Leo V decides that he wants to have intellectual backing for his ideas, and he decides to set up a commission of learned theologians under the young but talented John the Grammarian, and their job will be to amass support for iconoclasm by reviewing the scriptures and patristic literature. He has John's commission set up in seclusion at the palace, and they work for several months, and their job ultimately is to give Leo V the intellectual ammunition that he needs to get through a church council and to make sure that the icons are banished once again. In this sense, it looks like Leo V was actually imitating Constantine V rather than Leo III, since Constantine V had been the great intellectual of iconoclasm in the 8th century. So it looks like Leo V knew his history very well when it comes to how do you institute iconoclasm. Entering the year 815, Leo V was still not fully secure in his imperial authority. He had only been in power for about a year and a half, which means he had only had so much time to place his supporters in positions of power. The Patriarch was unfriendly to his designs, and he also had presided over some major catastrophes in the Balkans in the form of the massacres that Krum had inflicted on Byzantine subjects. So it's safe to say that Leo V was not extremely popular, and he didn't have a super mandate to go out and just act on fiat. So he'd have to move cautiously and with a great deal of wile if he wanted to achieve his ends in a timely fashion. His main goal, once again in direct imitation of Leo III, was to remove the icon over the main gate of Chowki Palace, and to do this, he wanted the support of Patriarch Nicephorus and Theodore Studium. He tried to sell it to them as a pragmatic move. Maybe he pointed out that the large number of soldiers from the east would find it offensive, and that it would be a way to appease them without really doing anything beyond the symbolic. But they protested vociferously, and they saw it as a slippery slope which would lead right back to iconoclasm. They too probably knew that Leo III had taken down that icon, and then 4 years later had instituted iconoclasm. So they were not going to be party to that. In response, Leo knew now he couldn't work with the authorities as they were, so he ordered all of the iconodules, at least the well-known ones, to be placed under house arrest, and then he sent his soldiers to start a riot about the icon, so that way he could send in other soldiers to remove it on the pretext that he was safeguarding it from vandalism. So this was very much a manufactured crisis, and Leo V made the most of his opportunity. This probably also was somewhat of a test to see how the public would respond to the removal of the icon, to see if people would be outraged that it wasn't there anymore, or whether they would be happy, or whether they would just be more or less indifferent to it. And apparently the results that he got were the results that he was looking for. In 815, Leo V felt confident enough to call for a church council, but he carefully controlled the invites so that iconoclasts would have a clear majority and they would win pretty much no matter what. Patriarch Nicephorus was then summoned to preside over this assembly, but he was unable to attend due to illness, so rather than waiting for him to recover, Leo declared him deposed and appointed Theodore Cassiterius, a relative of Constantine V, to be the new patriarch. The meeting ended up being contentious and included some physical altercations. Later on, the fact that this meeting had included some degree of violence helped to undermine its legitimacy in the minds of iconophile historians and theologians. Ultimately, however, this meeting was successful at banning the icons once again. The second coming of iconoclasm was engineered by the second coming of Leo III, and it showed. Leo V was not interested in persecuting iconophiles. His interest was more or less entirely about banning public displays of icons, and if his motives were mostly pragmatic, then maybe he thought that God would only punish the Byzantines if the Byzantine state was endorsing icons. Maybe that was his operating assumption. At any rate, if any citizen found an icon, they were entitled to seize and destroy it without penalty. But if people were caught with icons other than having those icons destroyed, they wouldn't really be punished. In effect, monks and others were known to use icons and to be on the iconophile side of the spectrum, and people more or less left them alone to do what they wanted in private. The one person who ended up being punished was Theodore of Studium, who probably had a bit of a martyr's complex, so he deliberately sought punishment so he could be punished for his views. And he only was punished by Leo V once he really went too far and tried to involve Pope Paschal I in Byzantine affairs. And if you are the emperor or patriarch, invoking the Pope and getting him involved in your affairs in the East is the ultimate no-no for any Byzantine subject, and I think that one could make the argument that Theodore Studium got exactly what he deserved for undermining the emperor's authority in that way. Like all of the iconoclast emperors, Leo V is portrayed negatively by Theophanes the Confessor. However, there are some things in his story which are a little too weird to chalk up to just straight up prejudice against iconoclast. And we're about to see one of the weirdest events in Byzantine history, if not the weirdest event. So, the years 815 to 820, outside of the iconoclast controversy, seem to have been pretty peaceful. But there was intrigue afoot, and theological tension could help drive that intrigue. At some point, Leo V had a falling out with his old friend Michael the Armenian. The reasons for this are not clear, but they were probably personal, and eventually Leo V orders Michael to be executed. And he comes up with a really bizarre way to have Michael executed. Michael was to be tied to an ape and then cast into the furnaces beneath the baths of the imperial palace, where he would either be maimed by the ape or die of dehydration and heat stroke. So in either way, he lost. But because Christmas was coming up, Leo decided to delay the execution until after Christmas, so Michael was left in his cell. And during that delay, Michael's supporters got together and organized. And they dressed up as choir members during Christmas Mass, and they approached the altar of the Hagia Sophia, and then they murdered Leo V in front of the public and proclaimed Michael II as the new emperor of Byzantium. My guess is that Michael the Armenian was involved in some kind of coup, or he was plotting in some way, or maybe he was even having an affair with the empress, something of that nature. But at any rate, we don't really know for sure. All we know is that he became the central figure in the resistance to Leo V, and that the conspirators rallied around Michael the Armenian. We'll get more into the details of that when we talk about Michael II's life. So, what was the legacy of Leo V the Armenian? The main thing, above all else, is that by helping to restore the peace, he helped to secure all of the gains that Byzantium had made in the Balkans, and he set the empire up to continue its revival. Basically, if Nicephorus I was an FDR-like figure, then Leo V was his Harry Truman. And I think that this legacy supersedes this whole obsession with Leo III and trying to imitate him at every turn. The second period of iconoclasm was not as intense as the first and never produced a zealous Constantine V figure. So this means that most of the time when people talk about the iconoclast controversy, they talk about Constantine V and the time of actual persecution. So Leo V's role in restoring iconoclasm was really not all that significant, and also most art historians think that most of the icons that were destroyed would have been destroyed in the first period rather than the second, so he probably didn't have an outsized impact on the poverty of our surviving art samples. I would have to say that when you think of that stereotype of what a Byzantine emperor is, no one meets that criteria better than Leo V. This guy was scheming, underhanded, amoral, but always interesting. And for that reason, like I said earlier, although he's definitely not one of the great emperors, he is still one of the most interesting. And I think that he's also a great example of someone who is too clever by half. His failed assassination attempt on Khan Krum backfired miserably, and apparently his elaborate James Bond villain-esque scheme to get rid of Michael the Armenian ended up being his downfall. Had he just merely had him executed normally, then there would be no figure for the conspirators to rally around, and he would have reigned longer, maybe even reigned long enough to send his son to the throne as Constantine VII. But of course he didn't, because he had to try to be too clever. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Leo V. Next time in this series, we'll look at Michael II the Armenian, or as he's better known, the guy who was not tied to an ape and thrown into a furnace.